Welcome to Restoring the Mind. My name is Khalid Mahmood. Today's topic is the war in Yemen and its implications for the Middle East. My guest this week is Isa Blumi. He's a professor at the Stockholm University. During the Kosovo conflict, 1998 to 1999, he was a member of the Provisional Kosovo government. After the war, he worked as a consultant for the United Nations mission in Kosovo. He's a professor of history at the Stockholm University. His most recent book is Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. Professor Blumi, welcome to the Restoring the Mind.
It's a great pleasure to join you and your listeners.
My question is that in 2011, a popular uprising forced President Ali Abdullah Saleh to hand over power to his deputy, Mansour Hadi. Soon after, Yemen began to unravel. First the economy, then the Houthis attacks, then the coalition attack, etc. Actually, it's what is my question would be what do the Saudis and UAE want in Yemen? I mean, why are they there for so long? I mean, wars are not cheap to run. So where is the return of investment for the Saudis and the UAE? Can you please tell us some historical background of this war? And is it just the Saudis and UAE, or are there other players involved as well? Please go ahead.
Yes, as this war and any war that we talk about, it does not come out of thin air. There are rationales for all parties involved, especially when a war lasts this long, that is so devastating. Over 400,000 people have likely died as a direct result of the war or strategies used to fight this war by an international coalition as it's marketed to the larger world, primarily arranged by the Obama administration in the United States, which had decided after many years of investment in Yemen, primarily to support a military, quasi-democratically elected dictatorship under Ali Abdullah Saleh, and the circle of allies that he was able to create since his taking power in 1978 in the former Yemeni Arab Republic, or North Yemen. The country itself would unify in 1990 under a set of conditions and pressures from the same United States primarily, in large part because the region, Southern Arabia, is sitting atop both very important strategic access points, entry to the Red Sea, control of the Western Indian Ocean. Yemen's territories are considered crucial for securing that, as well as monitoring the transition that was taking place with the end of the Cold War, in which many post-Soviet states were going to start seeing an evolution in which Yemen itself would be a part of. And the United States and its allies in the region and in the larger world were primarily concerned with assuring that the end of the Cold War did not lead to the creation of new centers of, let's say, hostile, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist states, in which southern Yemen, since throwing out the British in 1967, had successfully created a quite formidable Marxist state, very much isolated from the larger world, but nevertheless been able to secure an important role in the Cold War context. And with the lingering successful resistance of Yemenis also in the northern part of what becomes known as unified Yemen after 1990, the interested parties in seeing the transition in the Cold War to an entirely new global order of economic, political exchange. One would be associated with neoliberalism, the ascendancy of globalization as a primary model moving forward, in which countries that had formerly been outside the sphere of direct economic exploitation of Western interests, especially corporate ones, would now be integrated. And Yemen was certainly fit into that profile, as well as neighboring countries like Ethiopia and Somalia. Both of these once important allies to the Soviet Union in the Cold War context would also follow the trajectory of Yemen. Economic instability, regime change, if necessary, and the reorientation of these countries' economies towards servicing the interest of, again, this, what I will often repeat and refer to, global capitalist interests. Now, the transition from two independent Yemeni states was really initiated already in the 1980s by then Vice President George H.W. Bush, the father of probably the more notorious son, who became president later on. And this, the patriarch of this Bush family, who served as also head of the CIA in the 1970s and was instrumental in working with Kissinger to recruit China, Maoist China, into an alliance, a loose alliance to thwart Soviet expansion and influence in the global South throughout the 70s and 80s, would now invest some of his resources, human resources, and ability to apply pressure in Southern Arabia. In 1986, he ascends and meets with Ali Abdullah Saleh, at that stage the president and leader, military leader of North Yemen, and signs an initial set of agreements that would allow, for the first time, American oil companies access to what was deemed still an untapped great potential for exploitation of oil, both in the areas of southern Yemen, its offshore assets, as well as Somalia, which again, until the until the late 1980s, was deemed a unified country that could presumably reorientate itself to continue resisting the encroachments of capitalist interest in the North Atlantic world. And so the inducement of and the use of the classic military dictator that would have a political orientation towards one securing power for themselves, consolidating power around as much as possible as central state under the direct control of this would-be dictator of choice, in this case Ali Abdullah Saleh. The alliance made with Americans via the vice president of the time, Bush, and his primary allies from Oklahoma, the Hunt Oil Company, which would sign the first exploration agreement with North Yemen, led to a subsequent process of negotiating a unification of the two Yemens. Now recall, South Yemen at this time was a Marxist state. It's not by mistake that the moment Bush makes the visit to northern Yemen, southern Yemen sees an internal political crisis explode into violence. An attempted coup which led to the decimation of the Communist Party in southern Yemen, and the factions that had always been percolating there, seemingly operating in tandem with this Bush visits to the north, led to a shift in power. Southern Yemen now losing its main patron, the Soviet Union, now without the ability to sustain an otherwise let's say, stagnant national economy, did have one thing that was considered of high value to offer in this subsequent negotiations with North Yemen, again, facilitated by the Americans, who had already, as we probably know, a very strong stranglehold over the regimes that had existed since independence of the UAE in 1971, the creation of the Saudi state in the 1930s, as well as the other smaller states in the Gulf. This is, of course, the 1980s, in the throes of a war between Iran and Iraq, Iran having successfully overthrown the Shah, the primary asset of the United States since the Cold War began in the late 1940s. now seeing some kind of strategic reorientation with special attention to supporting dictatorships in the Arabian Peninsula. It so happened that they also had significant amounts of petroleum and natural gas, which will become an important part of the global economy soon enough. And so concerning Yemen, the process by which the Americans would gain and opportunistically secure the undeveloped resources of South Yemen, which did not have the money ever to develop pipelines and develop drill sets and allow for foreign oil companies on principle initially, but by the late 1980s, they were desperate to secure investments to explore for its known oil assets onshore and offshore. The problem is that the price of oil was far too low to justify any investment. And that's why it's particularly interesting that the Americans, under the Bush initiative in 1986, actually do sign agreements with North Yemen. Because again, oil prices were far too low to ever justify any big investment in new wells, drilling for new wells, exploring in a very difficult country like Yemen, which required as much day-to-day management of politics with local populations who could easily kidnap any engineers who were visiting the area to help in the exploration process, or if indeed wells were drilled and oil discovered, you would have to continue to negotiate with the various local populations who sat between the actual oil and the delivery to international markets. So Yemen poses a very interesting initial question: why the investment in Yemen? And it can only be answered over the long term with the benefit of hindsight. With the effective destruction of South Yemen, corresponding more or less with the end of the Soviet Union, the subsequent violent overthrow of regimes in Ethiopia and Somalia, that would open up the entirety of this region, geographically considered, again, strategically important because of its control over the Red Sea, but increasingly it becomes clear that this will be a region that is perfect for the new expansionist, globalist, liberal profile of development. Using sovereign debt, these will all countries now suddenly becoming quite addicted to IMF programs to secure international financing in order to develop infrastructure and to potentially expand the capacities to produce cash crops, to produce income from exportation of raw materials. Very much the story of post-World War II neo-colonialism throughout the world. So Yemen, just like its neighbors to the west in the Horn of Africa, are now being integrated into the global economy. And over the course of the 1990s, Ali Abdullah Saleh, with his alliance with the Americans, it's his on and off reliance on working with the Saudi, especially the Saudi state, which is bordering to the north of Yemen, now a unified country after 1990, will now use his new role as not only a unifier of this vast territory known as unified Yemen, but also to make sure that the initial investments will pay off for those internationalists, the globalists, including Bush and the people around Bush in the late 1980s. In order to do that, however, there would have to be a renegotiated relationship with the entirety of the population, who had demonstrated, and as I show in my book, throughout the 20th century, been able to resist these same forces that had successfully integrated the Middle East into their spheres of influence. So unlike the Gulf countries or Iran or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or other countries in what is known as the Middle East, Yemenis remained impervious to the first encroachments and offers of Western development, using very cunningly the very Cold War to balance the overtures and threats that were coming from the West, with Soviet as well as Maoist China's offers of assistance. This would be transformed, however, in 1962 with the overthrow of the Imamate in the north, a dynasty that had ruled parts of northern Yemen for over 1,000 years, would be removed from power with what I suggest, by looking closely at archival resources that I had spent considerable amount of time in Washington, in Britain, in Italy, and elsewhere, that the Nasser regime under Jamal Abdel Nasser, who became, of course, the darling of the global South in the late 1950s by challenging especially British and French claims of hegemony in the region, would become an interesting partner with the young Kennedy administration, seeing eye to eye in terms of where development, where modernity needs to be applied in these seemingly backward countries like Yemen. And so Egypt actually invades northern Yemen to support a small group of like-minded military officials to push, on paper at least, legally, a republic, the development of a republic that would be allied with the Nasserist project in the larger Middle East. This is at a time when Egypt had lost its ability to secure an alliance with Syria, that short-lived United Arab Republic that had put Syria and Egypt on equal in a coalition, fragmented and led to disintegration. And so Egypt's own standing in the Arab world became somewhat under question. And this opportunistic moment to enter into North Yemen's politics in the 1960s led to a horrible, degrading war of 8 years, in which 70,000 Egyptian soldiers at one point were based mostly in the cities of northern Yemen, and a resistance, a very resilient resistance that would shape the politics for a subsequent generation, were controlling the countryside. And this would ultimately lead to a transitional era in the 1970s that would usher in Ali Abdullah Saleh as this ambitious young officer, who again clearly became the main point of access for Western interests in that part of the world. And so his graduation, if you will, his primary role as now unifier of Yemen by 1990-91 came at the time in which regional politics was shaped by a set of conflicted narratives about the direction in which the Arab world should go. The rise and the empowerment of ruling families in UAE, in Qatar, along with the Saud family that had remained very useful to the American imperialist project by helping control the supply of cheap oil to American allies throughout the world since World War II, led to a momentary conflict which was personified in the Saddam Hussein invasion of Kuwait. Iraq, which had to carry the burden of trying to reverse the Iranian Revolution of 1979, that horrible war that led to the death of well over 1 million people in the war between Iran and Iraq, led to Iraq being destroyed economically, as well as heavily in debt to its neighbors to the south, which again had been expected to pay and subsidize Iraq's attempt to reverse the Iranian Revolution by war. And Saddam Hussein, and the way that this war was marketed as a war of civilizations, the Arabs against the Persians, Saddam Hussein became associated with the modern version of that project, very much like Nasser had been in the late 50s and early 60s. So Ali Abdullah Saleh and now unified Yemen, maybe because of political pressure from his larger population, who really resented, despised, especially Saudi Arabia, which since 1934 was actually occupying large parts of northwestern Yemeni territory, known as the Asir, or Najran and Jizan today, if you look on a map. So there was very little opportunity for Ali Abdullah Saleh to navigate beyond the phenomena of Saddam Hussein trying to take on the helm of leading the secular Arab progressive states to the post-Cold War era. The problem is that with showing some solidarity and demanding that UN intervene to stop war from happening, to arrest American adventurism and using Saddam Hussein's actions as a pretext to send large numbers of troops to the region, Yemen would be subsequently punished. A country that geographically is very rich, a very great potential for agriculture, lots of water from Indian Ocean monsoons that come twice a year. Unfortunately, under Ali Abdullah Saleh, as this is a crucial element that is really relevant to us today, much like many countries in the region, upon making deals with the Americans, agreed to shift their productivity from assuring food security, feeding their own people, to building a base for export. And in Yemen's case, it does have minerals. It will eventually have oil and gas. But at that time, it was cash crops that would be sent for markets abroad. And that led to Yemenis, in large numbers, losing access to land. And the availability of able-bodied Yemenis led to their exportation as cheap labor to the oil-producing Gulf. And this is a phenomenon where over 1 million Yemenis would end up working in places like Kuwait and Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia especially. And so by this time in which the war in Kuwait unleashes retribution to those who supported Saddam Hussein, the way they were able to do this against Yemen was to deport upwards of 800,000 of their workers. So suddenly, once a significant part of the male population in Yemen, which was sending money back on a monthly basis, were now out of jobs and were coming back in large numbers to put enormous pressure on this newly unified country in 1990-91. Now, what's crucial for the future is that these people, especially from Saudi Arabia, many of them had actually had children and had their wives with them, had become acculturated to Saudi orientations of, especially interpretation of Islam. So you begin to see a whole generation of Yemenis now going back to Yemen with a very explicit understanding that the world in which they are entering back into is somehow lacking proper Islamic training and orientation. And so large numbers of them become susceptible to receiving funding from Saudi charities and other interests to say, your command, your dawah is to now bring proper Islamic practices to Yemen. So it became within 6 or 7 months, the consequences of this expulsion of 800,000 people from Saudi Arabia led to a new kind of cultural dynamic inside Yemen itself, with Islam being the primary schism point, if you will. And this would be exploited by Ali Abdullah Saleh. He would use these hundreds of thousands of able-bodied men who would be willing to actually extend and start to enforce Islamic law as was determined by Saudi Arabia, to enforce certain social behaviors, from the veiling of women to organizing a society and enforcing restrictions on traditional other kinds of practices of Islam, especially amongst the Zaidi Shia of northern Yemen. And so you begin to start seeing sectarianism play itself out, very much as we would see in Iraq and Syria throughout this period as well. And this again became an interesting moment of opportunity for Ali Abdullah Saleh and his American allies, who had again been forged an alliance with formerly communist southern Yemen who, in agreement with unification, would be able to secure important positions in the unified government. So various portfolios remained in the hands of these former Marxists in the South, who had a very different vision for Yemen, a unified Yemen, than Ali Abdullah Saleh or his primary backers in the United States or Saudi Arabia. And that led to ultimately exploiting cultural politics and ultimately a war between what remained of armed elements of the South Yemeni army and those who sided with them as against Ali Abdullah Saleh and his growing cadre of allies who now believed that they had a mission to actually convert the entirety of Yemen to a kind of Wahhabism that we associate with Saudi Arabia. And again, this is not unique to the region, but it is something that is part and parcel of the global transformations happening at the end of the Cold War. In many ways, the war in Afghanistan, using jihadists, as we call it, recruited by the CIA, using former Yemeni individuals of Yemeni descent, especially Osama bin Laden, to help recruit these large groups of Takfiri who would go and fight in Afghanistan. This would then be a tool used in the subsequent 2 decades in other parts of the Islamic world. And Yemen would be at the crosshairs of this new tool of empire, I would call, using cultural disruptions, using the kind of divide and rule strategy mastered by the British for a previous century, is now going to be something applied in the context of post-Cold War Islamic world. And Yemen would suffer the consequences. The civil war in 1994 would lead to the victory of the North, with Ali Abdullah Saleh now the ascendant quasi-hegemonic actor, who would then use the same instruments that he used to subordinate South Yemen to start colonizing with these like-minded Takfiri types who again received money from first Saudi Arabia, increasingly now by Qatar, which had by the mid-1990s become a major player in the global scene via Al Jazeera. Especially Al Jazeera Arabic became a main instigator for this new vision about how Muslims should cohabitate with a very aggressive language about the sectarian divisions and how Shia are not welcome, Druze and other Muslim Sufi orders who are not subordinate to a particular framing of an interpretation of Hadith would be subject to persecution moving forward. And this would be the underlying destabilizing factor in Yemen, and used as an instrument for securing greater power by Ali Abdullah Saleh. Indeed, my first book on Yemen that I wrote in 2010 reflected on this strategy of authoritarianism by way of chaos, upsetting stability in society, upsetting the ability of these communities that still were heavily armed and still had a very strong sense of justice and did not subscribe to state centralization of power, and did resist these efforts by Ali Abdullah's state to integrate Yemen by way of the law, of the state law, imposing new kinds of so-called economic reforms that we associate with globalization and neoliberalism. This led to, throughout the 2000s, another war in the far north, which would, by mid-1990, 96, 97, take on the personification of a man named Houthi, who was a spiritual leader, but also a member of parliament, who was able to garner and create a large coalition that extended well beyond the region from which he came, which is the region of Sada in the far north, the area just bordering Saudi Arabia. And again, you must recall that this area of the borders between North Yemen and Saudi Arabia are indeed contested areas because Yemenis on both sides of the border believe that Saudis are just temporarily administering this region per the diplomatic agreements made in 1934. And indeed, until 2000, this region of northern Yemen and what is today understood to be southwest Saudi Arabia were actually quite open. So peoples who lived on both sides of the border can continue to exchange, conduct business. Animals could graze and eat across the border as seasonal rains brought food for animals on both sides of the border. And unfortunately, with the rise of this new neoliberal order in which the Clintonites in particular became associated with, they started to push for a militarization of the frontiers of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, pushing for a formal delineation of a border that actually did not exist until year 2000. And so there would be an agreement between Ali Abdullah Saleh and Saudi Arabia, at the behest of the American embassy, in which they would be able to then start to legally start allocating contracts for exploring blocks, especially in these vast areas that had yet been studied in northern Yemen, or what today is unified Yemen. So the oil politics certainly comes to play in all this, but there's also a strategic calculation that if we can somehow subdue this population in the north, using, if we have to, Wahhabi types to come and colonize these areas, to create small enclaves of hostile colonialists from elsewhere, set up schools that would train local population who wanted to join them in fighting the traditional, let's say, communities that existed in this borderland area. Over the long term, North Yemen's resistance to this process of global integration that had been persistent, again, for the entire 20th century, could finally be destroyed under the auspices of the Yemeni state trying to gain secure over a strategic border area now signed in agreement with Saudi Arabia and was now delineated as an actual border recognized by both countries in 2000. And the subsequent violence in this part became the foundations of what will now, until today, be known as the Ansar Allah movement, or the often misinterpreted and mispresented as a Houthi movement. Again, behind the assumptions behind this assertion is that this is led by charismatic men from the same family, the Houthi family, descendants of this one who would ultimately be killed in battlefield. And so this is the backdrop to a contentious space in northern Yemen, which will not subscribe to state centralization. It will resist the Ali Abdullah Saleh regime, who will also start to find the alliances that this regime has formed with sometimes rather nasty types who with considerable large number of loyal forces, whether it be within a makeshift a set of institutions that becomes known as the Yemeni army, or this much more organized, American-funded and trained Republican Guard, which would be very much attached to Ali Abdullah Saleh, 300 men, 300,000 strong, who would spend considerable amounts of their time subjugating and persecuting a campaign of power concentration in the hands of Ali Abdullah Saleh. But this is a force that is not able to actually subdue the resistance that emerges in the north. And it actually creates this pocket of now very principled actors who are not just followers of a religious movement or a religious scholar. These are people who are coming from different backgrounds. This is a much broader coalition of resistance to the Yemeni state, which is taken over by this dictator, who had even waged war using an alliance with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia actually sent troops in 2008 to northern Yemen, which was for most Yemenis a sudden desecration of Yemeni sovereignty. To actually get into bed with the Saudis was considered a huge political mistake. And from 2008, after the Saudis were defeated by these forces in the north, many people, even in southern parts of Yemen, began to recognize that this enterprise under the guidance of Ali Abdullah Saleh and these sometimes partnerships with assets that are funded by Qatar, by the UAE, by Saudi Arabia, by the Americans. There's a new generation of youth leaders that are being trained by the National Endowment of Democracy, the American USAID, by the UN. There are alternatives to Ali Abdullah Saleh. And we see this now manifesting in more and more violence against Ali Abdullah Saleh's allies and assets. There's also a recognition that Ali Abdullah Saleh is very corrupt. There are rumors already by late 2000s that there's billions of dollars that have been sent off to offshore bank accounts. His family, his extended family, are deemed to be incredibly corrupted. And he's making very questionable deals with especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia in terms of natural assets that many Yemenis believe should stay and remain within the sovereign control of Yemenis, but are now being sold off in big ticket contracts with Dubai Ports World, with some big oil companies that are now going to start pumping out large amounts of oil. Indeed, Yemen will be producing billions of dollars of revenue every year at some point before the events of 2010, 2011. So there's a lot at stake. Many Yemenis have now become alienated by this progression away from unification towards it becoming a chaotic authoritarian regime that's plundering Yemen's resources, working with foreign allies that nobody on the ground embrace. And there's ample reason for street protests that get out of hand by early 2011. And it so happens to correspond with the events happening elsewhere in the world, especially in the Arab world, whether it be Bahrain or Oman, Egypt, Syria, even inside Saudi Arabia, eastern Saudi Arabia. There's instability caused by, in Yemen, this very disruptive regime that is exploiting and squeezing out much of Yemen's wealth. The disruptions elsewhere, however, are the results of financial collapse of the global system in 2008. Equity markets across the region collapsed by the end of 2010, 2011. All those who had been seduced to move away from traditional forms of savings or investment in property, who got greedy and went in and put money, their savings, and borrowed money to put money into the Egypt Stock Exchange or their equivalents in the Gulf, saw all of their money lost with the crash of 2008, 2009. And with these kinds of events, you can have a spark that leads to a revolution. And this has certainly happened in a place like Yemen. And so Ali Abdullah Saleh long relied upon ally intermediary for the Americans. It's under Ali Abdullah Saleh that under the Clintons, then the Bush, and then the Obamas, they were able to go and use and develop drone technology. It's under the Obama administration, with the help of Ali Abdullah Saleh, to go and use drones to master this technique called the double tap attack, where they would attack initially a site, and knowing that people would come to try to rescue those people who were now injured by the explosion, would hit again. A very cruel and criminal way of fighting a counterinsurgency, if that's what they use as justification. The Americans were very tightly knit with the Ali Abdullah Saleh regime. But because he had become so toxic, and because even some of his most important allies, like Ali Mohsin, would defect and now try to harness the street violence that was happening in most Yemeni cities in early 2011. You see once those sitting on the sidelines or willing to cooperate with Abdullah Saleh begin to now venture out. The primary beneficiaries of this would be the Islah Party and a Muslim Brotherhood unit closely linked to Qatar, whose growing influence in Arabia, in Bahrain, most likely in UAE, certainly in many corners of Saudi Arabia as the legitimate, let's say, Takfiri Wahhabi regime. Saudi Arabia was long condemned as being a farce, too closely connected to the global interests of the United States and Israel. That many began, thanks to the campaigns through Al Jazeera and other media, began to gravitate towards Qatar as being the legitimate new generation of leaders in the Arab world. And this would manifest on the ground in Yemen. And it so happened that the Clintons and the Bushes, the neocons, as well as the Obama administrations were also very keen on seeing a transition that saw Qatar rise as the reliable spiritual as well as financial and political leader, not only of the Gulf, but also of the larger Arab world. Hence, these early successes of Muslim Brotherhood parties in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Yemen, with the potential for that to happen in Bahrain, but Saudi Arabia invaded Bahrain soon after to reverse what could have been another revolution that could have benefited Qatar. And so we are at this point now, it's 2011. There's, unfortunately for the Qataris and the American embassy who are backing them, while they have their assets, their potential youth leaders like Tawakkul Karman, she will actually be heralded as the natural leader of the Yemeni youth, of the new generation of leaders. Ali Abdullah Saleh will be cast aside. There will be an attempt on his life, and he will be badly injured. Another opportunity to get him out of the country and to steer Yemen's potentially very dangerous revolution away from resistance to the process that was happening over the last 20 years, globalization, integration in the global economy, and have a reliable asset of Qatar now take to the helm. The problem is that Tawakkul Karman, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, along with a leader of similar youth groups from Liberia that year, proved to be a bigot. And the party that she represented was not acceptable to a large array of Yemeni actors. And so they would have to go to solution B, and that would be the interim government, that they would elect the former very uncharismatic, weak Mansour Hadi, vice president for 25 some years under Ali Abdullah Saleh, someone with very little backing, with very little assets of his own or following of his own. And he would be an ideal candidate to try to arrest this process by which Yemen was going to fragment. And there was no guarantee that American and Qatari interests would be served by what would happen next. Because again, those in the far north, those who had been resisting Ali Abdullah Saleh in those wars in the 2000s, had gained considerable support. Many of their supporters had already moved to the big cities of Sana'a, of Taiz, and they had taken over large parts of the city streets of the major cities of Yemen, and had a big following. These so-called Houthis, what we today will call Ansar Allah, moving forward. A broad coalition, again, that cut across geographies and even sects, religious sects, or Muslim sects. And they were deemed to be a legitimate force that could counter the influence of the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Americans through Qatar. And in the end, the international community had to intervene under the pretext that they wanted to avoid civil war. And they imposed this, what they called interim government. a government that had been forged to specifically avoid having to deal with this, especially disruptive forces in the north, what again were called Houthis back then, or, and an emerging movement to restart the process of separation of the former South Yemen from this larger disaster. We would call them the Southern Transitional Council, STC. And what's interesting about the politics here, by 2012, as the United Nations is invited to come and intervene, give a seal of approval to an interim government that Americans basically choose, and impose this Mansour Hadi as the interim government, which will be now recognized by the Security Council, including China and Russia. Unfortunately for the Americans and others, the vast majority of Yemenis would not accept this. This would be an imposition by outsiders. There was a parliament that had been elected. They were not allowed to actually hold session to perhaps initiate a process of negotiations, which was the pretext for this interim government, that under Hadi, the Americans and the UN would oversee bringing together of all parties to have a discussion about how the future new constitution should look and how Yemen can transition away from this regime that had been in power since 1978. Again, the problem is they had no interest in seeing certain parties be part of this process. They were terrified that if the ones who really held popular support on the streets were allowed to dominate the negotiations, that Yemen would actually be steered towards a direction of at least independence along the lines of what we're beginning to see, these BRIC alliances that are being formed. The last thing they wanted to see was an important country like Yemen, with all its untapped wealth, now becoming an independent country that makes decisions that service the interest of its people first, and not the globalists that had long secured an assumption that they could dictate on the global community, on the global economy, reforms or certain kinds of forms of government that would benefit them most. And that's the period, this 2012 to 2014 period, under this Mansour Hadi, this imposed interim government that never secured a vote from the people, who started to write and transform Yemen in a rapid pace with no politics involved. There would be no negotiation as Mansour Hadi integrates Yemen into the World Trade Organization. He starts to borrow money from the IMF. He starts to initiate reforms, quote unquote, that would privatize large swaths of Yemeni land. You'll begin to start seeing Yemen adopting and signing agreements with investment banks to put and integrate Yemen into a system of finance and credit that would induce large-scale debt amongst those who remained outside a formal economic system. What we call microfinancing, made famous in India and Bangladesh, would be something exported to the Islamic world, given a seal of approval via these instruments that Deutsche Bank basically put together, and Yemen would be the laboratory for this microfinance project for the rest of the Islamic world. Much of the contracts that Ali Abdullah signed, especially with Dubai Port World, were subsequently null and void, declared null and void, and renegotiated to benefit primarily Qatari and Saudi interests. Yemen, which had already become integrated into these investment schemes, especially of Qatari money, that were now building gated communities for investment in Yemen, in Sana'a, the capital, in other cities, were clearly aiming to now integrate Yemen in entirely new ways. There was a major investment project that had already been visited in the late 2000s to build a bridge that links Djibouti, the country of Djibouti in East Africa, with Yemen, and would allow for then an entirely new set of possibilities for investment development. new projects that correspond to the 2030 vision of Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to develop the entire Red Sea coast, to build multiple cities like Dubai that would become the playground of global tourists, kind of bringing a Kabul or to develop the Red Sea as a big tourist destination, but this would, of course, allow for enormous amounts of money to be poured into construction. But this would all require access to water, food, and labor. Building a bridge that would link Yemen with the Horn of Africa, in those days under reliable regimes in Addis Ababa and in northern Somaliland. That would mean that Ethiopia could become now, with its newly envisioned dam, the Blue Nile, which is almost completed by now, would allow for water to be piped to the water-poor parts of Arabia. That would also integrate Jordan and Israel in joint investment projects with Saudi Arabia in the far north of the Red Sea. All these things would, however, require some kind of stability in Yemen, which was not on offer with this shaky Ali Abdullah Saleh government by 2010. And all these projects would now collapse with the larger state of the international finance. And what's crucial about all this is that in the meantime, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, who are rivals, far more enemies to their respective projects, seeing each other as rivals and competing for the same pool of international credit. They were all running up big deficits, borrowing far more money than they can actually produce from selling gas or oil. But that's the nature of the political economy of post-Cold War era anyways. These resource-rich countries are going to borrow enormous amounts of money with seemingly unlimited amounts of credit available to them to build infrastructure, to build these fabulous cities that they promote, to develop national airlines that become global players. But by the time of 2010, 2011, it becomes clear that this is not sustainable. Especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE saw themselves now in a precarious situation where they could not sustain a system heavily dependent on subsidized rent being delivered to otherwise very dangerous potential rivals to the ruling families, whether they be cousins or they be other families that lost out at some point in the 20th century. And in the case of Saudi Arabia especially, it no longer serving the purpose of being the price setter, the one who can actually control the supply of oil. It no longer has the ability to pump an extra 2 to 3 million barrels in oil if needed by the global markets. May become superfluous. It becomes increasingly clear that under the political tensions that are emerging in the family, it's a very violent period, this era, when you see Mohammed bin Salman rise at the expense of his rivals in the family. That Saudi Arabia, in the long term, is in a desperate situation that can only be resolved if they somehow make sure that Yemen, for instance, becomes its primary arena for growth, for access to the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, but also access to Yemen's huge potential for oil and gas, to supplement and expand the claims that Aramco could have to assure that it would have continued good credit with the outside world. The same applied for the UAE, which was itself hemorrhaging money, and at the time of 2013, 2014, the consequences of the financial resetting of the world meant that there was a level of precarity, especially for Dubai, which lost its ability to generate cheap credit in the global markets, meant that there was a lot of pressure to also make sure that they could secure the lucrative business opportunities that Yemen availed. And the very fact that this Hadi interim government had actually ripped up previous contracts with Dubai Ports World and other Abu Dhabi-based investment schemes with mining and oil meant that the UAE could have been shut out from the Yemeni, the potential for Yemen's markets and investments. And a similar set of calculations are at play with Qatar, which again felt it had the allies on the ground in power, and that they believed that Yemen was indeed going to be an extension of their growing influence in the world. And then suddenly in 2014, after some really egregious abuse of executive power by this Hadi interim government, signing away Yemen's sovereignty, tearing apart old agreements, privatizing and selling off to the global markets, the global investors, large tracts of Yemeni lands. And then finally, the last proposal to make Yemen into a federation in which much of Yemen's oil and gas would be allocated to Hadramaut, a vast territory with only about 1 million people living in it, and the rest of this 5 federated zones would be poor, resource poor, but have the lion's share of the Yemeni population. And that was considered by a number of actors as the last straw, that clearly this interim government was going to finalize the destruction of Yemen's ability to be independent. And they arrested him. And it was a broad coalition that included large members of Ali Abdullah Saleh's GPC party and the Republican Guard. Indeed, Hadi, upon being arrested for breaking and breaching and selling off Yemen's assets without actual debate in parliament, without actually coming to an agreement on a constitution that would allow Yemenis to be participants in this decision-making process, he signs away his own claim of sovereignty. And this would result in an outcry from the American embassy, and would mobilize these 3 primary interested parties to the north, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, to start a campaign to initiate, which could be under the cover of legitimacy from the UN. The GCC would participate in returning and reinstating a legitimate President Hadi to power. Upon it becoming clear that this was not going to happen, that the Yemenis had had enough, they very rapidly moved to phase 2, which was to actually start to use the threat and then actually do initiate violence. The war starts in March of 2015, despite the fact that there was a reported opportunity for a negotiated settlement, that clearly you needed to include those elements in the far north and in the south who had long been left out of this interim process. The UN head negotiator at the time was actually pleading with the world not to allow for this threatened war to start, because he was feeling he was getting quite close with a settlement, where there would be an elections, and then they can actually go back to this process of negotiating with everyone at the table now. Clearly the Americans under Obama, under Susan Rice and Samantha Power, these people who are back in power again with the Biden administration, would prefer to unleash a war which they believe would last not very long. And again, under the pretext of the larger region, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, as the regional, let's say, policeman, kind of the role that NATO would have positioned itself as in the context of North Atlantic world, or the African Union in Africa. They would initiate a military campaign that would prove to be very brutal, had no interest in actually making incremental offers of ceasefire. They were hoping to completely destroy the ability of especially the Northerners, who were in open revolt at this stage, to destroy their ability to feed each other. They went after food stores, they went after bridges, they went after cisterns and wells, destroyed farmlands using cluster bombs to make it difficult to farm, and were also with some extraordinary advanced weapons that were clearly at the experimental stage, these bunker-busting bombs that were probably had some, the equivalent of a nuclear bomb, a small-scale nuclear bomb, were detonated in the mountains above Sana'a. You can see these things on video. They're quite terrifying, what they were using. And yet the people who were resisting on the ground refused to capitulate. And this is the process by which a horrible, horrible war would extend for many years, in which these partners who had relied entirely on air power and hoping that 2 weeks of air campaign would end the war, and then they could secure their interests in a subordinate Yemen, proved to be a war that would last again and again until today, with these northern Yemenis demonstrating an incredible resilience. They are very firmly organized and unified. Upwards of 23 million people are living now under 7 years of siege. There's a complete embargo on this part of the Arabian Peninsula. No food, no energy flows without it being filtered through by the United States and other allies in this, enforcing this embargo on the north. It's resulted in starvation, the spread of disease, the inability to safely farm has made many hundreds of thousands of Yemenis vulnerable to attacks, to putting themselves in a situation where they can die from the cluster bombs, they can die of starvation, or they can try to migrate. And what's remarkable about is that in fact most people from this region did not migrate to those areas secured by the American-led coalition that will be considered areas of a recognized Yemeni state by the international community. And so 7 years of horrible, horrible war has not led to an end of the war. It is in fact, over this period of time, the people resisting the American-led coalition of Saudi, UAE, Qatari assets, with mostly mercenary forces on the ground from Sudan, paid for by who knows whom, from Colombia. Clearly a lot of European former soldiers are working on behalf of the American-led coalition. That despite all of this, the northern Yemenis under embargo have been able to win victory after victory. They've have been able to develop primitive drone technology and even ballistic missiles, which they've been able to fire upwards of 1,000 kilometers deep into Saudi and even Abu Dhabi territories. And some of these attacks have been quite destructive, to the extent that the last round of attacks in early February of this year, which led to the destruction of water desalination plants, a couple of key refining areas in Jeddah, as well as an electricity producing factory in the east, in Dhahran, most likely initiated the declaration of a ceasefire. 7 years of war, there have been calculations that Saudi Arabia has to spend somewhere of 300 million a day to sustain this war. It is no one is allowed to look at their books, but you can just monitor what's happening in that country from the kinds of austerity that's being imposed on its people. Never imagined in the 1980s and 1990s that supposedly such a rich country would start demanding its citizens paying VAT taxes, that its citizens would have to pay other taxes that are especially hard on the working poor. You're seeing Saudi Arabia selling off large swaths of Aramco issuing IPOs in the hope that they can continue to get for outside money to fund the sustenance of this regime. And yet it becomes increasingly clear that they cannot. And the UAE is going through a similar process. Despite oil prices reaching $110, $115 a barrel these days, it's still the production costs, especially for Saudi Arabia in these periods in which large parts of their infrastructures are bombed by the northern resistance in Yemen. It means that they are not able to actually produce much revenue. And this is an important dynamic to this war that never gets discussed. And it's something that I want to highlight, and this is why I stress this, is for everyone to keep an eye open for these kinds of tensions that are reflective, not necessarily in the newspapers, but one needs to read between the lines and begin to start recognizing that, in fact, there's a scramble for revenue. There's a scramble to somehow reduce costs in these for these governments, these regimes. And the most recent capitulation, in many ways, was due to the fact that they were not winning this war. They were losing territories that were threatening the few oil wells that are still producing oil in Yemen. This was already happening in the late 2021, but really played itself out in interesting ways in February of this year. And basically, the Biden administration and their Qatari allies, who had been threatened by Saudi and UAE, and had been basically fighting with UAE and Saudi Arabia through proxies inside Yemen, and probably other parts of the world, whether it be in Syria or elsewhere. But in 2017, it was a formal break, and Saudi Arabia almost invaded Qatar, like they did in Bahrain in 2011. And Qatar was only saved by special forces from Turkey sent in at the last minute to protect them from invasion. Now with the Biden administration back in power, meaning the Obama and Clintonites, those who had originally started this war in 2015, so the architects of this war who were briefly out of power because of the Trump administration are back in power, and they've made it very clear that they're going to rehabilitate Qatar. Qatar is going to be their primary asset once again in the region, and this has resulted in a new set of agreements involving all those parties who are supposedly fighting to try to restore power to the legitimate government in Yemen. The problem is that the face of that legitimate government that they claim exists, Mansour Hadi, has now just been removed from power. And they've been replaced by a presidential council of 8 men, who, 2 of whom represent the different disparate factions that are supposedly fighting to bring the northern Ansar Allah party, those are resisting globalization, to their knees. They have been proven to be so incapable of actually conducting this war. Cruel as it is, the use of air power certainly makes this a never-ending disaster for northern Yemen and a nightmare for its people, as they can't live safely, can't move anywhere safely with these American drones and fighter planes dropping bombs everywhere. On the ground, it's a disaster, however, for this coalition. And the Biden administration has clearly, with its arrival, after winning the election, supposedly, in 2021, they have now tried to consolidate and reshaping policies in the region to return, if you will, the old assets to the forefront. And that means Qatar and UAE, at the expense of the UAE, and to a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia. And this is manifested by the very fact that now this Hadi is gone, and there's now a presidential council dominated by those with sympathies towards Qatar, at least on the surface. But it's all under the pretext of a ceasefire, which will allow Americans to somehow bring order to a very disorderly coalition that, again, has been mostly fighting amongst themselves, while dropping unheard of numbers of ordnance on these poor people, these 23 million plus people in northern Yemen. And so this is a long hour of recapping, at least since the 1960s, what has been happening in Yemen. And there are plenty of ways to go about explaining in details what's going on, but I think this is an overview that could be useful for your audience, and I'm willing to take any questions you have now.
Thank you very much. I think I think the last question on anybody's mind would be that do you see this conflict ending anytime soon within the next 3 to 5 years, maybe? But I think to some extent you've already answered that, and with the Biden administration back in power, it doesn't seem like that they have any intention of ending their involvement in the region anytime soon.
They definitely will not surrender their campaign until there's a capitulation. It would be a disaster for them if Ansar Allah were able to secure Yemeni sovereignty. Yemen as a country does not exist anymore as a unified country. So the best that we're going to see is a continued contentious ceasefire with very little aid coming to the north. Many other countries are suffering from similar tactics. Syria, Lebanon, parts of Sudan and certainly Iran are under a perpetual embargo now for decades. So there's no reason why they wouldn't continue to do that. Whether or not they're going to continue dropping bombs, I don't think so over the long term, because who's going to pay for it? The Americans are certainly not going to pay for it, and their allies, their puppet regimes in Saudi Arabia is a very fragile one at this moment, and there's no guarantee that it survives. In fact, you may see, much like what we saw with Iraq and Libya, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, you may actually see Saudi Arabia being broken apart at some point, or the UAE, with Qatar becoming the ascendant power. But many things constantly get in the way. The very fact that Yemenis resist translates into a set of unpredictable outcomes that brings hope to those people who are still willing to stand up for justice and protect themselves and their family from the criminality of this globalization process. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be peace, I'm afraid. No.
Yeah, in today's news, there is that U.S., I'm quoting from the zerohedge.com website, U.S. blames Russia for Yemen hunger crisis, praises Saudi role.
Oh.
I think that's everything.
It says a lot, doesn't it? Yes.
It does. Thank you very, very much, Professor Blumi, and grateful for your input and information, and look forward to having another chat with you soon. And
thank you for the opportunity. My best to you and your family.
Thank you.